Washington Journal continues.
The eternal flame at Arlington National Cemetery and the gravesite of our 35th president, John F. Kennedy. Joining us from New York is Richard Reeves, the general editor of the book, The Kennedy Years. Thanks very much for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Let me begin by asking you about this iconic scene at Arlington Cemetery and the idea of the eternal flame. Where did that come from?
You got me. I don't know. I had never, I guess there was an eternal flame at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. And that's probably where Mrs. Kennedy got the idea. It was her idea.
As we look at the events from 50 years ago, one of the fascinating stories, and I just talked to David Hawkins a moment ago, is how Washington came together to prepare for the funeral, something that was, of course, completely unexpected, and yet taking a page from the assassination of President Lincoln a century before.
Right. The people who think government can't be effective, they certainly handled that situation well, and I think that David Hawkins, too, pointed to the role that Mrs. Kennedy had in all that. It was obvious that history was what was on her mind.
I want to share with you just some of the moments following the assassination of President Kennedy. And this is a conversation between the Air Force One cockpit pilot and Andrews Air Force Base, and they were discussing President Kennedy's body and how it should be transported when it arrives here in Washington, D.C. This is late in the day on November 22nd, 50 years ago.
Air Force One, Andrews. Duplex is on, sir.
Duplex is on. This is Dr. Berkeley. What arrangements have been made regarding the reception of the President?
Everybody aboard Air Force One, everyone aboard Air Force One, with the exception of the body, will be choppered into the south grounds. The body will be choppered to the Naval Medical Center at Bethesda. Over.
The body will be choppered or will go by ambulance to the Naval Medical Center?
Will be choppered.
I have called General Heaton and asked him to call the military district of Washington in regard to this. Would you call him and cancel the arrangements to have it go to Walter Reed as we had spoken to him? I didn't know these arrangements were already made.
Say again, Doctor.
His body is in a casket, you know, and it will have to be taken by ambulance and not by chopper.
That exchange between Andrews Air Force Base and Air Force One Duplex, by the way, the code name for a Secret Service agent. And Richard Reeves, as you listen to that, you do get a sense of the chaotic atmosphere as people trying to get information and figure out who had to do what.
Yes, I think so. And I think they did extraordinarily well in doing that. And Washington is a city that's good with ceremony. And this was the greatest ceremony of our lifetime, even bigger than an inauguration.
We have been seeing so many moments from Walter Cronkite and others announcing the death of President Kennedy, but I want to share with you in the president's hometown of Boston. It was an afternoon session on November 22nd, 1963. The Boston Symphony Orchestra and Eric Leinsdorf, who was leading the orchestra, broke in with this news. Let's watch.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a press report over the wires. We hope that it is unconfirmed, but we have to doubt it, that the President of the United States has been the victim of an assassination. We will play the funeral march from Beethoven's Third Symphony.
A rather dramatic moment from 50 years ago in the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Richard Reeves, have you seen or heard that before?
No, I knew Eric Leinsdorf too, but I didn't realize that had happened. I must say that that clip is really moving. and the people, imagining, I suppose that the people in that crowd at that concert were kind of represented a microcosm of the nation and the nation's response to something that we never thought would come our way again.
Where were you 50 years ago?
50 years ago, I was a reporter on the Newark Evening News in New Jersey, and I did what I suppose every reporter in the country did, was jump in my car and get down to the office, which was in Morristown, New Jersey. And it was one of those situations where really we had nothing to do with it, so that what we were doing was getting reaction. And I went to the mayor of Morristown and the Democratic chairman of that county in Jersey. I went to their office, which happened to be in the same building, and he was near tears. I was not near tears because I was working, but there was a window washer outside the window, doing the windows, and he couldn't hear us. He was waving and smiling to us, and we didn't respond the way he thought we would. He said, at that moment, he was probably the only person in the country who didn't know what had happened.
We're talking with Richard Reeves, who is the general editor of this book, The Kennedy Years, which we should point out came out 20 years ago on the 30th anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy. What new have you learned since then?
Well, in my own life, I've learned a great deal about the presidency. I had not yet begun to write President Kennedy Profile of Power, so that it was all a learning experience for me over an 8-year period while I worked on that book. And the things that most impressed me were I realized how much of a cultural figure John Kennedy was, which is one of the reasons we're here talking about this now, and also that the presidency itself is a reactive job. I mean, it's an act of faith. We had a great deal of faith in this man, because not only the 40-odd people who've held the job know what it's like, but it's not at all like what they campaign for or prepare for. Again and again, they're reacting to events unforeseen, and we're dependent on, to a large extent, on one man's judgment, not so much his intellect or even his background, but his judgment. How do you deal with a situation, from oil spills to invasions to the Arab Spring? That doesn't change about the job, and that's one of the things I learned about the job. About Kennedy himself, as I did that, I realized that this is going to be commemorated again and again, not so much because people are aware of the things that happened in his presidency, many of them very dramatic, but they understood that he was, he kind of brought us into modernity. He was quite different than most of us. He was rich, he dressed differently, he had long hair, he didn't wear hats, and soon all American men had stopped wearing hats and were letting their crew cuts grow out. And I don't think you ever, they were role models, he and his wife, for the modern American. And he's a self-selected president. He never would have become president under the old system of bosses and conventions. He went out and won it with the press, won it with organizations he set up in every state, and then won the primaries. And one of the ways it changed us was he wouldn't wait his turn. And I think now that most Americans won't wait their turn, which is why our institutions are always being battered by ambitious younger people.
Which is what, I just want to point out, that's what James Reston wrote in the New York Times in 1963, and you reprinted it in your book. along with a photograph of President Kennedy's flag-draped casket from the East Room at the White House. He is gone now at 46, younger than when most presidents had started on their great adventure. But one other point, Richard Reeves, from your book is the relative calm in the nation the weekend after his assassination and that Monday during the funeral services. Why?
I think it was a death in the family. People were in shock. They didn't know what to say or do about it, and it was this extraordinary spectacle of millions of people having lost someone they considered they knew.
Richard Reeves, I'm going to jump in if I could.
For television.
I just want to jump in for just a moment because we want to show the scene at Arlington Cemetery, and this is the Royal Highland Regiment, the British Bagpipers, as they are performing live now at the Kennedy gravesite. From Arlington National Cemetery, 2 British bagpipers from the Black Watch, part of the Royal Highland Regiment. As we continue our live coverage here on C-SPAN, we are rejoined by Richard Reeves, General Editor of the Kennedy Years. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to get that moment live here on C-SPAN.
Yes.
Let me go back to your thoughts.
Well, my thought, it was a death in the family in a way that was, television was in our living room. I think that most of us watched hour after hour after hour, and then came Jack Ruby killing Oswald, and we were kind of numb. It was one of the first times we were overloaded with information and with grief. The Mary McGrory of the Washington Star was with Pat Moynihan, later senator from New York, and said that these 2 Irish icons, and Mary said, you know, we'll never smile again. And Moynihan said, we'll smile again, but we'll never be young again. And I think that's the way it affected most. It was the end of this generation's youth and of the nation's innocence. That this couldn't happen to us, but it did.
This morning, the Washington Post has a sketch of the scene at Dealey Plaza along Elm Street in Dallas, Texas, a dark day in the American presidency. And Richard Reeves, one point of this story is that the tragedy forever changed the accessibility of presidents, of course, most notably that open-air car that we will never see again.
Because the Kennedy administration and the president himself really had created a culture of assassination. I mean, the whole world knew we were trying to kill Castro. We had provided the weapons that killed Trujillo in the Dominican Republic. Just before Kennedy took office, Patrice Lumumba of the Congo had been assassinated, and people kind of took for granted that that's what governments did. But again, on the American side, we thought we were immune when in fact our leader was the least protected in the world. And that of course has all changed. One of the things that strikes me about the pictures we used in that era was there was one particular picture of Kennedy holding a couple of his nephews' hands and little Caroline's hands crossing a street in Hyannisport with the car stopped and ordinary citizens around them watching them cross. That will never come back. We put our presidents in a cocoon, and because it was necessary, but that doesn't mean that it's been beneficial either to the presidents or to the country. I mean, they lose sight of the public, and the public can't get near them.
Richard Reeves, who has written for New York Magazine, the New York Times, the Newark Evening News, and a contributor to PBS. He is joining us from New York. He is the general editor of the book The Kennedy Years, as we reflect on the events from 50 years ago. We've also divided phone lines regionally, and if you are old enough to remember where you were 50 years ago, we want to hear your story as well. Tim is joining us from Gainesville, Florida. Good morning.
Good morning, Steve. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you. I wanted to make a quick comment, and then I wanted to ask a question if I could. No. Hello?
Tim, you're on the air. Go ahead.
Oh, I'm sorry. I got cut. Good morning, Steve. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you.
Yep, we heard that. Go ahead. Go ahead with your question.
I have a quick comment, and then I wanted to ask a question. I wanted to thank C-SPAN for educating me about President Kennedy's Africa policy and how instrumental it was in solving the Cuban Missile Crisis. I also wanted to ask Mr. Reeves this morning, and it's wonderful to be speaking with you as well, about President Kennedy being uniquely positioned as our first Irish Catholic president in his civil rights speech to speak about it as something as old as the scriptures and clear as the Constitution, that we have no caste or class system or master race, and how that should really be for all Americans 50 years later. Thank you.
Tim, thanks for the call.
Well, yeah, I mean, Tim is describing part of an extraordinary 48 hours in the Kennedy presidency when he gave his, what was called the peace speech at American University, saying perhaps we should take another look at the Cold War. How did we get into it? Are we really adversaries, or are we all moral? And do we all care about our children and what will happen to them? And then when he came back to the White House from AU, Governor Wallace, George Wallace, was standing in the doorway at the University of Alabama, of which he had appointed himself provost, because he wanted to block the entrance of the first two black students to attend, Vivian Malone and James Hood. And it was an extraordinary American moment because our National Guard units are state units. So George Wallace was the commander of the Alabama National Guard, and they were on the scene. However, the president has the power to federalize the National Guard, and then he becomes its commander. And Kennedy decided he would do that. And so that the same people protecting Wallace, in a way, then turned their guns and bayonets, which they had, toward him, and he left with his state police. Kennedy, against the advice of most of his people, all of his people, wanted to go on television that night to talk about what had happened. Like most politicians, he had hoped he would not have to deal with civil rights. It was an issue that we always wanted. I mean, everyone, in a way, knew something was going to happen. Kennedy was kind of caught in the middle as a politician because the Congress was dominated by Southern Democrats in those days, segregationists, Herman Talmadge, people like that, and he depended on them as the Democratic leaders of the Congress. And they kind of thought, they did think, that secretly he was on their side, that he was just a Northern politician pandering to a minority group. But that minority group, which was beginning to come alive with its young people and sit-ins and freedom riders, things that surprised Kennedy, unforeseen events, he went on television that night with just notes. He didn't have a speech written out. He had a lot of facts, and he gave one of the great speeches in American history, 2 within 48 hours, when he said this is not a regional issue, this is not a political issue, this is a moral issue. It is about what kind of people we are, and if people are equal, who among us would choose to be black? And it put an extraordinary thing. It put the government of a democracy on the side of a minority. And that is no small thing through the history of all democracies, and particularly of ours. The president took sides, and he chose the minority. And that was also the night that, God, things were happening around the world. It was in that period was the first monk who burned himself to death in Saigon, and the field secretary of the NAACP listened to the speech on the radio. He was traveling in Mississippi where he lived and drove home. This was Medgar Evers, and he had called his wife and asked her to keep the children up because he wanted to talk to them about what the president had said and what it would mean to their lives and to all American lives. And as he stepped out of his car, a sniper across the road shot him, and he bled to death in front of his children. So that these were events of high drama, which kind of mobilized the thinking of our generation, at least my generation, and we didn't know then that these events would not be lost in history. They're still almost current events because there was a density of event in the Kennedy presidency, whether it was the Bay of Pigs, whether it was the nuclear test ban treaty. It was an extraordinary time, and he did as well as he could, and we appreciated it, I think, too.
This AP photograph just moments before the shots were fired in Dallas, Texas. The President and Mrs. Kennedy wearing her Chanel suit. And Bill has his reflections on where he was 50 years ago, sending in this tweet. I was in the 7th grade English class, Sidney Lanier Middle School in Falls Church, Virginia, when the announcement came over the school PA system. Herb is joining us from outside of Buffalo, New York in Orchard Park. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. Mr. Reeves, good to see you again. I've followed you on TV more years than I want to count. But my question kind of relates to Mr. Kennedy in this way. And by the way, where was I when I heard about the assassination? I was sitting in my office in Rochester, New York, and one of my assistants came in running from a couple of blocks away and told me about it. But going back to a question for Mr. Reeves, Eliot Spitzer's political career is probably ended because of indiscretions. You know the history of President Kennedy's indiscretions and infidelity over the years. If the American people were aware of that, would his standing in history be reduced? And should we be giving Mr. Kennedy a pass on that part of his life?
Thank you, Herb. We'll get a response. Richard Reeves.
Well, I think we do give him a pass on that part of his life, and far more dangerous to his political ambitions as really a self-selected president who found a way to become was his health. I think his health would become public today, and that would eliminate him. In terms of his womanizing and infidelities, you know, rich people, and he was a rich person, have long driveways. You can't tell what's going on there. He was very comfortable with secrets and with lies, and I don't think it affected his presidency, and it certainly doesn't affect the way we think of him now. I was stunned by last week's Gallup polls showing that 75% of the respondents considered Kennedy the greatest of modern presidents. And the group that felt most strongly that way, more than 85%, were people between 19 and 28. Not only didn't they know Kennedy, their parents probably didn't know him. So have we absorbed it? Have we forgiven him? Obviously we have. We think of him as one of our great men.
I want to share with our audience the immediate coverage, and of course this is the morning after the front page newspaper below the fold, the Baltimore Sun, and the reporting at the time of Gerald Griffin, who was in the Washington Bureau of the Baltimore Sun. The headline, "Close parallels are noted in the Kennedy and Lincoln deaths." He says, President Kennedy's sudden death today in Dallas ended a brief but brilliant chapter in American history. In a flash of an assassin's gun, the nation was sent plunging into grief for the young, popular president who already had seemed well on his way to a triumphant re-election next year. Eddie Barker was a TV journalist. He, by the way, passed in July of last year and reflected in an event that we covered on how the media dealt with the immediate story of the Kennedy assassination and trying to get that story to readers, viewers, and listeners.
We call our first panel here Instant Decisions, directing the coverage. And very frankly, I can't think of a time in history when it was more important to make a decision very quickly and then hope to God that you were right. And this panel that we have with us this morning are the folks that had to make some of those decisions, and I think that history is pretty well recorded that the decisions they made at the time were decisions that they can still live with 30 years later. I was in the decision-making business then too. One of the things that I think that we really have to think about as we reminisce of what happened back then was the tools that we had to work with 30 years ago compared to the tools that we have to work with today. In television, of course, we had black and white film. We had old DH and DL cameras that we hoped we had the good sense to pull the filter out of when we went inside to take inside footage. We knew how to run an Oricon camera. We knew how to make a tape recording. Hopefully we knew how to edit film, how to write to film, and how to go on the air.
Live scene at Arlington National Cemetery and the posting of colors at the gravesite of our 35th President, John F. Kennedy. Let's watch for a moment. One of a number of ceremonies at Arlington National Cemetery, and the only surviving member of the immediate Kennedy family, Jean Kennedy Smith, the younger sister of President John F. Kennedy, who served as the U.S. ambassador to Ireland during the Clinton administration, among those on hand for their tributes and the posting of flowers and the the regiment, the military regiment, the posting of the colors and the wreath at the tomb of President John F. Kennedy. Richard Reeves of the Kennedy years joining us from New York. Go back to your thoughts.
One of my thoughts, excuse me, about all this that we forget really, but hits us, the President of the United States is not only the head of government, he's also the head of state. So he is the equivalent of the British Prime Minister and the Queen. The President is the physical embodiment of the American people, and so that he had a position above. He has a position above party, and most of us respond to that he speaks for the nation, and that was brought home to us because as we were talking about television, he was in our living rooms. We thought in some way that we knew this man, which brings us back to the death in the family reaction of millions of people.
We'll watch the scene at Arlington Cemetery and hear from Eddie, joining us from Marlborough, Massachusetts. Good morning.
Good morning, Steve. Mr. Reeves. Well, I was born on March 21st, 1960, so at the time it would have been a little over 3.5 years, 3 years, 8 months old, and I always remember it was my first cognizant memory that I ever had was being in the kitchen of our third-floor apartment and my mother crying. And I remember asking her, what was wrong? Why was she crying? And, she come out and said that a bad man or someone had shot the president. And to this day, I would have, I'd give $1 million to remember, the follow-up questions I'm sure I probably asked her, as any 3.5-year-old would. But I always, every time in later years, too, that she really wasn't, she was a strong woman. She really didn't cry that often, but I can remember to this day that her crying, and it really affected her like I guess it did the rest of the nation. But, every time I hear of the assassination, I always think that was the first thing that I can ever really remember happening in my life, is my mother really, how hard she took it that day. That's all I have to say. Thanks, Steve.
Eddie, thanks for the call. I'm going to go back to this photograph. It's become one of the iconic photographs of November 22nd, that open-air motorcade with the President, First Lady, and in front of them, Nellie Connolly and the Governor of Texas, John Connolly, who has since passed away. He became a friend of President Nixon and himself running for president, but losing in that bid. Back in 1991, he reflected on what it was like to be in the motorcade and have been hit by the sniper, Lee Harvey Oswald.
We were in a parade, a motorcade, down through the main part of town. The crowds were extremely enthusiastic, warm, excited, exuberant. And just after we turned off of Main Street, Nellie turned around and said to the President, "Mr. President, you can't say Dallas doesn't love you now." And he said, "No, you can't." We turned on Elm Street to go under the overpass, and I heard this sound that I thought was a rifle shot. I turned to look over my right shoulder, because that's where the sound came from, to see if I could see anything. I didn't, and I was in the process of turning to look over my left shoulder when I felt an impact as if someone hit me with a closed fist right in the middle of my back. The force was strong enough where it knocked me over, and I saw that I was covered with blood. So, frankly, I thought I had been fatally hit. My wife pulled me down in her lap. She was seated in the jump seat on my left, and I was seated on the jump seat directly in front of the President. She pulled me down into her lap, and about that time I heard another shot, about that loud, a smack. And my eyes were open, I was conscious, and I saw the blue velour interior of this presidential limousine covered with blood and brain tissue. And I knew that the president had been fatally hit.
From July 1991, the comments of former Texas Governor John Connolly. This weekend on C-SPAN 3's American History TV, we will be focusing on the Kennedy assassination 50 years later. And today on the C-SPAN networks, two reflections that you can watch here on C-SPAN and also on C-SPAN Radio at 12:30 Eastern Time at the moment in which President Kennedy was assassinated. Live coverage from Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. Historian David McCullough will read JFK speeches. Also, the U.S. Naval Academy Men's Glee Club will be performing. Of course, President Kennedy was a veteran of the U.S. Navy. And from the JFK Presidential Library and Museum in Boston, starting at 2:30 Eastern Time, singer and songwriter James Taylor among those performing, and Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick speaking and commemorating the life and legacy of President Kennedy. Let's go back to your phone calls. Cynthia is joining us from West Palm Beach, Florida, with Richard Reeves, who's joining us from New York. Cynthia, good morning.
Good morning.
Cynthia, turn the volume down on your set. Go ahead with your question, please.
Good morning.
Cynthia, you with us?
Yes, I am.
Please go ahead.
I actually was in Philadelphia when the president was shot, and I was going to be returning to Palm Beach. In any case, I was divorced Roman Catholic Republican, and 5 days later got a call indirectly from Mrs. Rose Kennedy, and she asked me through an employment agency to become her personal secretary. And I did, and I stayed there for two and a half years, traveling with the house. And, of course, up in Hyannisport, we had Jackie Kennedy and the children, and many of the visitors. I have not written, or I haven't published anything about it, but I've written extensively about the wonderful people.
Cynthia, what have you written? What are your memories of Rose Kennedy and Jacqueline Kennedy?
Rose Kennedy, I would say her religious strength. There's no question about it. That her best friend was God, and she was very careful in turning to Him when there were difficult times. And that, of course, was because of her training with the nuns. Jackie Kennedy was the kindest woman I have ever met. She thought of other people. She was very aware of what was going on, and she didn't react immediately. I think that she weighed the circumstances, and I think also that she brought great comfort in riding horses. That whereas Rose Kennedy turned to God, and Jackie Kennedy, had a faith too, but she found great comfort in the out of doors and God's land.
And Cynthia, again, the years that you worked for the Kennedy family, what were they?
It was December '63 through July of '66.
So it was in the immediate aftermath of the assassination.
Exactly right.
I'm going to have you stay on the line because I want to see if Richard Reeves wants to ask you a question.
Well, I'd very, very much like to be in touch with him.
Stay on the line, Richard Reeves.
First of all, when you said Cynthia from West Palm Beach, I have a daughter. One of my daughters is a teacher in Royal Palm.
How wonderful!
And her name is Cynthia. So I thought, my God, is my daughter calling?
God.
I must tell you, I'm just stunned that you were registered with an employee agency, and Rose Kennedy called the agency?
Called him, gave a false name. They then pitched my credentials, and she said, I want her to start tomorrow. I was up in New York, could not get on an airplane flight. She said, call the Secret Service or FBI, tell her she's my secretary, and put her on a flight. And he just laughed, and he said, I think I'd better check this out. But he called back in 20 minutes. Right. He said, you're on a flight. And that was my introduction to power.
Cynthia, let me ask you one other follow-up with regard to all of that, because you were with her, obviously, just a month after the assassination. What do you remember about what was going on inside the family, how they were dealing with the grieving process of the suddenness of the assassination of her son, the 35th president?
The family didn't come over to the big house. Well, this is down in Palm Beach, but they didn't. A lot of them didn't stay there, primarily because of the ambassador's illness. You know, out of respect for that. The grieving that Mrs. Kennedy did was a very personal grieving, and I've written extensively about her religion, and I'd like to talk to Mr. Reeves or his daughter, you know, and see what we can do about this.
Cynthia, thank you for the call. Richard Reeves.
How did Joseph, do you know how the president's father, Joseph Kennedy, was given the news, or was he?
Well, I don't know. He was given the news. I believe that Ann Gargan, who was in charge, who was a family member and in charge of his medical treatment, spoke to him about it, but I don't think he was told immediately. I believe it was the next day, and Teddy was up there, and the family had come around. And it was very hard to know what his mental capacity was. I was there when President Johnson visited the ambassador, and that's a unique story.
Well, share it with us, Cynthia.
For those who don't know, the president's father had been disabled by a stroke.
That's right.
And I guess he couldn't speak except for a few words. And as you say, it was hard to understand how much of his mental faculties were working.
Exactly right. It's exactly right. But if you would ask your daughter to call me, I'll give the phone number afterward.
I'm going to see her. I'm going to see her tomorrow.
And Cynthia, I'll have you stay on the line. We'll get your phone number. One final question, though. You made a reference, and we hadn't heard this story, that President Johnson met with the Kennedy family, including President Kennedy's father. So you were there. Tell us what you saw and heard.
Very much so. I won't tell you. I'm not going to tell you on the air, but it was a unique experience.
Cynthia, from West Palm Beach, Florida.
And I will talk about it.
Okay. Stay on the line. We'll get your phone number, and we'll pass it on to Richard Reeves, who's joining us from New York. Appreciate your recollections from 50 years ago. Meanwhile, this book that came out, Dear Mrs. Kennedy, The World Shares Its Grief, in letters to November 1963. And it was in January 1964, on January 14th, that former First Lady Jackie Kennedy thanked the public for their support.
I want to take this opportunity to express my appreciation for the hundreds of thousands of messages, nearly 800,000 in all, which my children and I have received over the past few weeks. The knowledge of the affection in which my husband was held by all of you has sustained me, and the warmth of these tributes is something I shall never forget. Whenever I can bear to, I read them. All his bright light gone from the world. All of you who have written to me know how much we all loved him, and that he returned that love in full measure. It is my greatest wish that all of these letters be acknowledged. They will be, but it will take a long time to do so. But I know you will understand. Each and every message is to be treasured, not only for my children, but so that future generations will know how much our country and people in other nations thought of him. Your letters will be placed with his papers in the library to be erected in his memory along the Charles River in Boston, Massachusetts.
From 1964 to this Friday morning, November 22nd, 2013, and at the Kennedy gravesite at Arlington National Cemetery and the Eternal Flame, as photographers capture the moment. Earlier, family members, including Jean Kennedy Smith, on hand, the younger sister of President Kennedy, to pay tribute to our 35th president. And this morning, the headlines from around the country focusing on what happened in Dallas. This is from the Detroit Free Press. 50 years after the Kennedy assassination, a day I'll never forget. From the Tallahassee Democrat, shock, sadness, and disbelief is the headline in that photograph just moments before Lee Harvey Oswald firing the shots in Dallas, Texas. From the Orange County Register, the day JFK was shot. And there's this from the Richmond Times-Dispatch, enduring mystique, JFK 50 years later. And from the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, JFK, that awful day in Dallas. Larry is joining us from Maryland. Good morning to you.
Good morning, Steve. Thank you for taking my call. I was about 10 years old when I received the information at school, just devastating. Since that time, it's haunted me immensely over the years. So much information has come out. And I'm quoting here. I'm reading something that says, perhaps there was one assassin, but he did not act alone. Dallas was the ideal location for such a crime. William Walton, a friend of the Kennedys, speaking on behalf of Robert and Jacqueline Kennedy, used a back channel to give this information to Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev. I'm haunted by the House Assassination Committee back in '76 coming up with Kennedy was likely assassinated as a result of a conspiracy. Former Senator Hart yesterday in the Huffington Post just said that American journalism has failed to follow up on this story. What's your reaction when you hear that, in lieu of the fact that, as was mentioned by Mr. Reeves, that Kennedy was trying to do a sea change in policy of looking at what had typically been foes of the Cold War in light of his June 10th American University speech.
Larry, thanks for the call. Richard Reeves.
I don't believe any of it. I do. As I mentioned before, the culture of assassination as zeitgeist was abetted by John Kennedy and his brother Robert because of their obsession with Castro and the fact that we had plot after plot to try to kill the man, but it was our man who was killed. I've spent a lot of time on the site. I don't doubt that, excuse me, Oswald was a very strange fellow, and he was a member of Fair Play for Cuba and other left-wing organizations, whereas the danger in Dallas would be from, it was a very right-wing city at the time, and it may be that the events, that the Kennedys' attempts to eliminate Castro did motivate Oswald, but I don't think there was any conspiracy, and as we know, Oswald had wanted to try to kill General Edwin Walker, who was a right-wing icon in the country at the time. He's been forgotten, thankfully. But I do think he acted alone, and that so many of these theories, based on things, one set of conspiracy theories, the grassy knoll theories, that there were, you know, if you listen to them, there were a battalion of people hidden on the grassy knoll. Well, the grassy knoll is like a big suburban lawn. It's not. It was a very small setting, and I think that the conspiracy theories and whatnot of a young prince being shot down, an athlete dying young, really inclined a lot of people to think this could not have been an individual action of hate and passion and evil. It's hard to accept. And as this gentleman said, he's haunted by it. Well, a lot of Americans were haunted by it and have continued to try to find a reason, a conspiracy, a group. Who did this? The mafia did this. Cubans did this. The communists did this. I think it's a natural reaction, but I don't think those things happened.
Let me go back to this headline again from the Baltimore Sun, November 23rd, 1963. Texan who lived in Russia charged in the assassination. And a quote from Captain Will Fritz, head of the homicide section of the Dallas Police Department, said that Lee Harvey Oswald had made no statement, had signed nothing, and had admitted no part in the president's death. And then, of course, just 2 days later, this photograph this morning, Monday morning, of the New York Times as Jack Ruby lunging a gun to Lee Harvey Oswald, shot and killed before live cameras on a Sunday morning, just 2 days after he allegedly killed President John F. Kennedy. A light rain is falling here in Washington, D.C. on this Friday morning, and the scene at Arlington Cemetery as the crowds continue to gather to pay tribute to President Kennedy. Eddie is joining us from Millbury, Massachusetts. Good morning. Welcome to the program.
Good morning. I often question about the Kennedy's trip to France. You see, after the Second World War, we gave up independence to the Philippines. England gave it to India. France did not give it. They wanted to hang on to their colonies in Africa, Algeria, Indochina, hence Vietnam. Hence, Kennedy sent troops there when the French were defeated. I often wonder what happened on his trip there with Jackie to France. Thank you.
Richard Reeves, comment?
I think, obviously, the visit that I think is most important, in 1954, then Senator Kennedy went to Vietnam, and he also, I'm sure the caller recalls, that President Diem of South Vietnam was a Catholic, and he had lived in the United States, in New Jersey, and had been supported by the Kennedy family. And when young Senator Kennedy in 1954 was on, there was a rooftop bar on the Caravelle Hotel, which was then the tallest building in Saigon, and he was having a drink or coffee with a young American diplomat named Gullion, Edward Gullion, later became the dean of the Tufts School of Diplomacy. And as they were doing it, and as night fell, as they were talking, and night fell, there began flashes across the river and explosions. And Kennedy said to Gullion, "What's that?" And Gullion said, "That's the Viet Cong." And Kennedy said, "Well, what's going to happen?" And Gullion said, "They're going to drive the French out, we're going to come in, and they're going to beat us too." So that it wasn't that Kennedy didn't know France's role. I mean, we were against the French in terms of colonialism at that time. A lot of I think why, Kennedy, Johnson is blamed for Vietnam, but Kennedy, there were we had 1,500 men there when he became president, advisors so-called, and when he left it was 17,000. And part of it was that Democratic presidents, including Barack Obama, are under regular attack from conservatives about being weak militarily, not strengthening the military of the country. And Kennedy wanted to avoid that, but I don't know if anything happened between he and de Gaulle in that trip, but Kennedy knew almost as much as de Gaulle and the French knew about what was once French Indochina, and which we wanted the French out. But then, to prove how tough we were, we went in there, and as Colin Powell years later said in another context, we broke it, we own it. We broke Vietnam. Jack Kennedy, President Kennedy, twice signed off on coup plots in Vietnam, once in August of 1963, and then again on November 1st of 1963, when we told the generals in Saigon that we would not interfere if they tried to overthrow Diem, which they did immediately and killed him immediately, and all this is forgotten to history, largely because Kennedy was dead 3 weeks later. So that his decisions then about Vietnam, as the years went on, the war became more unpopular, his people and some journalists would say he intended to get out. Maybe he did, but it's a hell of a lot easier to get in than get out of situations like that, as we've learned over the years in other countries. And one final thought I have about it, there was a book which had great influence in this country called The Ugly American, which was about Vietnam. We called Sarkan in the book, but and it was a book saying America should straighten this out and this is how we should do it. Kennedy gave that book to every member of the Senate and every member of the House when he was still a senator. So he was not, without knowledge of that part of the world, and he made a huge mistake, which most people blame on Johnson. And ironically, Johnson gets all the credit for civil rights when it was Kennedy who risked his political career first by backing the minority.
Richard Reeves, who is the general editor of the book The Kennedy Years. He's a longtime reporter joining us from New York. We have a few more minutes in our conversation with him. I want to share with you the headline from the hometown newspaper of President Kennedy, the Boston Globe, and a reprint of a photograph from 1963 at Harvard. And this headline, "The news hit a rogue wave, sudden, unthinkable, savage. For Boston as nowhere else, the death of the president was a death in the family. Word spread in an instant by Walter Cronkite and by word of mouth. Then the city froze in place to watch and mourn for what seemed like one endless 72-hour day." Carmen is joining us. Hamilton, Montana. Good morning.
Hi, Steve. Thanks for having me on. This is Carmen DiCrescenti up here in Hamilton, Montana. I was in high school, Troy High School at the time, sophomore, just getting out of geometry class, and the halls were packed. But there was like a wave of buzz was coming down the hall, and I didn't know what it was. And I had passed 2 rooms going on the way to back to my homeroom because we were going to leave school. And I seen teachers hanging over their desks, crying and sobbing. And then I got a little scared. I didn't know what the heck's going on here. This is really weird. And I turned into my homeroom, and it was dead silence. We were all watching our teacher crying. He couldn't even stand up. It was so terrible, the news. And then finally he stood up and said, "Our president's been murdered." And then, oh boy, the responsibilities for wars back then, I don't think anybody had a responsibility for war. So I heard President Kennedy made a provision that would shatter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and put the responsibility for wars under the Joint Chiefs of Staff. I think this was very key to what was going on, because he had said something like that. It's not our responsibility to go in and help the Vietnamese out. It's like in America, you have to earn your own freedom. And I found myself in Vietnam and Tet Offensive just a couple years later because of what was being it was like all these leaders were getting slain right after that. All our country's leaders, and if it was like we were children of a slain father figure, and then at the same time they had the Warren Commission that or down there trying to stomp this all out, and I guess Alan Dulles was in it, and I think he was one of Kennedy's big enemies. And they went down and saw Ruby, and he asked for asylum in Washington, D.C., and they said, "We can't take you up there. Nobody can protect you. Nobody can protect you in jail." I thought, what a ridiculous thing. And then Ruby said, "Well, if you don't protect me, I will be dead, and that nobody will ever know what I know about a new form of government coming in to take over."
We'll stop you at that point. Carmen from Montana, Richard Reeves.
Well, people were numbed, hit by this, and thought about an awful lot of things. A series of events was so extraordinary. And also, those of us of an age, including the caller, one of the things that came out of the technology was our history is becoming more and more visual. One of the things that projected John Kennedy into the American psyche, his father was president of RKO, the movie studio, so that all these films, Technicolor, which wasn't that common when John Kennedy, didn't exist for most people when John Kennedy was a child. There is this film and video and tape record of his life almost from childhood, because they were a rich family and they built around the children. And so that's why I think, or one of the reasons, that we're also personally involved in this in a way we aren't always with political events. Again, it was the end of our innocence, that we were somehow protected from all the bad things going on in the world.
Patrice is joining us from Port Jefferson, New York, with Richard Reeves, General Editor of the Kennedy Years. Good morning.
Yes, it was just testimony in reference to where we were when Kennedy was assassinated. My husband was based at Biggs Air Force Base with Strategic Air Command at the time. And I recall being home with my little one at about lunchtime and heard this come over the radio, and immediately went next door to one of the wives, and we were just so upset and couldn't believe this were happening. And then my husband was called to an alert. They were at the base at the time and were on high alert with Strategic Air Command. I've enjoyed this testimony of the gentleman before me. That's the only comment I do have.
Patrice,
and one thing I would like to add, though, I recall, it seemed to me about 6 months before the assassination that Kennedy was coming from a trip at California. And there at the not at the air base, but the national airport, and we lived right near there. He did stop, and they had a big platform about 12 foot high. And I went there to see him, and I really recall what a handsome man he was. But anyway, what surprised me at the time, and I even recall saying this to my husband, was that the security at the time was just, if it were there, I didn't know it. You could park your car and just walk right on up the field to the tarmac. You didn't even have to enter and be checked out. It's just amazing, you know, how free it was, and the hundreds of people who would come and park just like I did. But that certainly has changed, thank God.
Most notably, even Pennsylvania Avenue, which has since been closed as a result of the bombing in Oklahoma City, but that didn't happen until the mid-1990s. Richard Reeves, I want to share one more piece of sound with you. This is from Lady Bird Johnson, who we've been focusing on as part of our First Lady series, and in her diary explaining what happened the moments after the shots were fired, courtesy of the JFK Library in Boston.
The cars accelerated terrifically fast, faster and faster. Then suddenly, they put on the brakes so hard that I wondered if they were going to make it. As they wheeled left around a corner, we pulled up to a building. I looked up and saw it said hospital. Only then did I believe that this might be what it was. Yarborough kept on saying in an excited voice, "Have they shot the president? Have they shot the president?" I said something like, "No, it can't be." As we ground to a halt, we were still the third car. The Secret Service men began to pull, lead, guide, hustle us out. I cast one last look back over my shoulder and saw a bundle of pink, just like a drift of blossoms, lying in the back seat. I think it was Mrs. Kennedy lying over the president's body.
The first-hand account from Lady Bird Johnson in her audio diary, and this headline from USA Today: "The scars still visible around Dallas. Richard Reeves.
And they are. The one thing we haven't touched on here, or one thing we haven't touched on, was the event was so traumatic in itself, but also there was, without knowing, I think one of the reasons so many people believe conspiracy theories was, for all we knew when that happened, this was the beginning of World War III. That was also something that was being thought in the country. It was so there was real reason the government favored people who don't like the Warren Commission, the single assassin theories. For all we know, sitting in New Jersey or New York or wherever we were, this was the beginning of war and maybe the beginning of the end. And that's another thing that left people. We had never faced anything like that. The United States had not been invaded or at war since the War of 1812, where things happened on our soil. So yeah, the post-traumatic stress that was almost national, I think, was probably inevitable. The personal shock, the living room, the member of the family, but also the potential of nuclear war.
Richard Reeves, I want to conclude on 2 points. First, the role that the First Lady, Jackie Kennedy, played in the days that followed. What was it?
Brilliant. I mean, she was obviously fantastic. She had her kind of imagining of and creation of Camelot has a lot to do with the legend, and this legend isn't going to go away. We have to remember John Kennedy was and is forever young. Ironically, if he'd served 2 terms, which I think he would have, and then lived to a good old age, I mean, he would be being interviewed as an old man on the Today Show or something, but he was never an old man. He was young, and his youth was taken away, and so was ours.
And finally, the next and final stop on that trip to Texas was Austin, Texas, a 2-day trip that included Fort Worth and Houston. The morning began in Fort Worth, and then, of course, the events in Dallas. But this is a what-if question. Had he lived, what could we have expected in the 1964 campaign?
Well, he would have won in 1964. I mean, he was obviously popular, had approval rating. I think I've forgotten exactly what it was, but the high 70s or 80s. He talked a lot. He loved politics. This man loved politics. He recreated the way we picked our president. He was self-selected, as so was Carter and now Obama, other Reagan, and so that he, and when he talked about it, he thought, excuse me, he thought his opponent would either be Barry Goldwater, senator from Arizona, or Governor Nelson Rockefeller of New York. And in private, what he said was, it's not going to be that tough. Goldwater's too dumb to be president, and Rockefeller doesn't have the guts to go for it. It wasn't a bad observation. He would have been a good political reporter.
Richard Reeves, who is the general editor of the book The Kennedy Years. He's joining us from New York. Appreciate your time and perspective on this 50th anniversary of his assassination.
Thank you, Steve. You guys, I mean, you're doing a wonderful job. You know, hopefully the anniversary will help bring us together. At the same time, in Washington, we're splitting farther apart. We were united then, and it was a different country, and we've lost a lot of that. A lot of it because of the assassination, too.
Richard Reeves, thank you. Well, social media today, we want to point your attention to this tweet, JFK Elm Street, essentially tweeting in real time what happened 50 years ago, and this tweet quoting Jacqueline Kennedy at the time.
Washington Journal continues.
The eternal flame at Arlington National Cemetery and the gravesite of our 35th president, John F. Kennedy. Joining us from New York is Richard Reeves, the general editor of the book, The Kennedy Years. Thanks very much for being with us.
Well, thanks for having me.
Let me begin by asking you about this iconic scene at Arlington Cemetery and the idea of the eternal flame. Where did that come from?
You got me. I don't know. I had never, I guess there was an eternal flame at the Arc de Triomphe in Paris. And that's probably where Mrs. Kennedy got the idea. It was her idea.
As we look at the events from 50 years ago, one of the fascinating stories, and I just talked to David Hawkins a moment ago, is how Washington came together to prepare for the funeral, something that was, of course, completely unexpected, and yet taking a page from the assassination of President Lincoln a century before.
Right. The people who think government can't be effective, they certainly handled that situation well, and I think that David Hawkins, too, pointed to the role that Mrs. Kennedy had in all that. It was obvious that history was what was on her mind.
I want to share with you just some of the moments following the assassination of President Kennedy. And this is a conversation between the Air Force One cockpit pilot and Andrews Air Force Base, and they were discussing President Kennedy's body and how it should be transported when it arrives here in Washington, D.C. This is late in the day on November 22nd, 50 years ago.
Air Force One, Andrews. Duplex is on, sir. Duplex is on, this is Dr. Berkeley. What arrangements have been made in regards to the reception of the President?
Everybody aboard Air Force One, everyone aboard Air Force One, with the exception of the body, will be choppered into the south grounds. The body will be choppered to the Naval Medical Center at Bethesda. Over.
The body will be choppered or will go by ambulance to the Naval Medical Center?
Will be choppered,
I have called General Heaton and asked him to call the military district of Washington in regard to this. Would you call him and cancel the sequence to have it go to Walter Reed?
From Arlington National Cemetery, 2 British bagpipers from the Black Watch, part of the Royal Highland Regiment. As we continue our live coverage here on C-SPAN, we are rejoined by Richard Reeves, general editor of the Kennedy Years. I didn't mean to interrupt you. I just wanted to get that moment live here on C-SPAN.
Yes.
Let me go back to your thoughts.
Well, my thought, it was a death in the family in a way that was television was in our living room. I think that most of us watched hour after hour after hour, and then came Jack Ruby killing Oswald, and we were kind of numb. It was one of the first times we were overloaded with information and with grief. The Mary McGrory of the Washington Star was with Pat Moynihan, later senator from New York, and said himself, as I did that, I realized that this is going to be commemorated again and again, not so much because people are aware of the things that happened in his presidency, many of them very dramatic, but they understood that he was, he kind of brought us into modernity. He was quite different than most of us. He was rich, he dressed differently, he had long hair, he didn't wear hats, and soon all American men had stopped wearing hats and were letting their crew cuts grow out. And I don't think you ever, they were role models, he and his wife, for the modern American. And he's a self-selected president. He never would have become president under the old system of bosses and conventions. He went out and won it with the press, won it with organizations he set up in every state, and then won the primaries. And one of the ways it changed us was he wouldn't wait his turn. And I think now that most Americans won't wait their turn, which is why our institutions are always being battered by ambitious younger people.
Which is what, I just want to point out, that's what James Reston wrote in the New York Times in 1963, and you reprinted it in your book, along with a photograph of President Kennedy's flag-draped casket from the East Room at the White House. He is gone now at 46, younger than when most presidents had started on their great adventure. But one other point, Richard Reeves, from your book is the relative calm in the nation the weekend after his assassination and that Monday during the funeral services. Why?
I think it was a death in the family. People were in shock. They didn't know what to say or do about it, and it was this extraordinary spectacle of millions of people having lost someone they considered they knew.
Richard Reeves, I'm going to jump in if I could.
For television.
I just want to jump in for just a moment because we want to show the scene at Arlington Cemetery, and this is the Royal Highland Regiment, the British Bagpipers, as they are performing live now at the Kennedy gravesite.
I suppose every reporter in the country did was jump in my car and get down to the office, which was in Morristown, New Jersey, and it was one of those situations where really we had nothing to do with it, so that what we were doing was getting reaction. And I went to the mayor of Morristown and the Democratic chairman of that county in Jersey. I went to their office, which happened to be in the same building, and he was near tears. I was not near tears because I was working, but there was a window washer outside the window, doing the windows, and he couldn't hear us. He was waving and smiling to us, and we didn't respond the way he thought we would. He said, at that moment, he was probably the only person in the country who didn't know what had happened.
We're talking with Richard Reeves, who is the general editor of this book, The Kennedy Years, which we should point out came out 20 years ago on the 30th anniversary of the assassination of President Kennedy. What new have you learned since then?
Well, in my own life, I've learned a great deal about the presidency. I had not yet begun to write President Kennedy Profile of Power, so that it was all a learning experience for me over an 8-year period while I worked on that book. And the things that most impressed me were I realized how how much of a cultural figure John Kennedy was, which is one of the reasons we're here talking about this now, and also that the presidency itself is a reactive job. I mean, it's an act of faith. We had a great deal of faith in this man because not only the 40-odd people who've held the job know what it's like, but it's not at all like what they campaign for or prepare for. Again and again, they're reacting to events unforeseen, and we're dependent on, to a large extent, on one man's judgment, not so much his intellect or even his background, but his judgment. How do you deal with a situation from oil spills to invasions to the Arab Spring? That doesn't change about the job, and that's one of the things I learned about the job. About Kennedy.
We had spoken to him. I didn't know these arrangements were already made.
Say again, Doctor.
His body is in a casket, you know, and it will have to be taken by ambulance and not by chopper.
That exchange between Andrews Air Force Base and Air Force One duplex, by the way, the code name for a Secret Service agent. And Richard Reeves, as you listen to that, you do get a sense of the chaotic atmosphere as people trying to get information and figure out who had to do what.
Yes, I think so. And I think they did extraordinarily well in doing that. And Washington is a city that's good with ceremony. And this was the greatest ceremony of our lifetime, even bigger than an inauguration.
We have been seeing so many moments from Walter Cronkite and others announcing the death of President Kennedy, but I want to share with you in the president's hometown of Boston. It was an afternoon session on November 22nd, 1963. The Boston Symphony Orchestra and Eric Leinsdorf, who was leading the orchestra, broke in with this news. Let's watch.
Ladies and gentlemen, we have a press report over the wires. We hope that it is unconfirmed, but we have to doubt it, that the President of the United States has been the victim of an assassination. We will play the funeral march from Beethoven's Third Symphony.
A rather dramatic moment from 50 years ago in the Boston Symphony Orchestra. Richard Reeves, have you seen or heard that before?
No, I knew Eric Leinsdorf too, but I didn't realize that had happened. I must say that clip is really moving. And the people, imagining, I suppose that the people in that crowd at that concert were kind of represented a microcosm of the nation and the nation's response to something that we never thought would come our way again.
Where were you 50 years ago?
50 years ago, I was a reporter on the Newark Evening News in New Jersey, and I did what